At 0418 on a grey morning in 1942, a US submarine surfaced just outside a Pacific anchorage with its batteries low and its crew running on coffee and exhaustion. The boat had been gone roughly 3 weeks, call it 20-plus days, thousands of miles of ocean, and dozens of hours at periscope depth at 3 to 5 knots, only to come home with the one thing a submarine captain could not afford: nothing to show. No torpedoes fired, no silhouettes in the crosshairs, just an empty patrol log and a crew that had stared at the same horizon for so long that even a cloud looked like a ship for a second. Inside the control room, the numbers didn't lie. Fuel down, food down, morale down. Torpedoes still in the racks, 12-16, maybe more untouched. And the ocean, the biggest battlefield on Earth, had made them feel small and blind, because out there. Japan's war machine was not starving. Not yet. Ships were moving oil, ammo, rice, troops across routes so wide they looked like freedom on a chart. To stop that, early war doctrine preached something simple, Hunt. Get eyes on the target, make contact, close the range, put steel in the water. You couldn't sink what you couldn't see, and you couldn't see what you couldn't find. But that was the problem. The Pacific didn't reward effort. It punished it. A submarine could burn 48 hours creeping through a likely shipping lane, never see a mast, then spend another 12 hours dodging aircraft because the one time it surfaced to charge batteries. The sky decided to be unlucky. A wrong guess wasn't just wasted time, it was exposure. It was a boat caught at the surface with a thin skin of steel between it and a bomb, with only seconds to dive when the lookout shouted plane and the conning tower ladder turned into a bottleneck. And still, the reports kept coming back the same way, empty-handed. Somewhere on shore, far from the spray and diesel fumes. Commander Dudley W. Knox sat in a room that did not rock with the sea. A desk, a lamp, a stack of patrol summaries, a map so large it needed 2 hands just to flatten the corners. He was the kind of officer combat men sometimes dismissed with a single phrase desk-bound. Theoretical, the guy who never had to listen to a depth charge explode at 50 yards and rattle your teeth. They didn't say it kindly, because when submarines were failing at sea, nobody wanted lectures. They wanted targets. But Knox and the analysts around him kept seeing the same pattern submarines weren't losing because their crews were timid or their captains were blind. They were losing because the ocean was too big for Hunt harder to mean anything. You could be brave for 24 straight days and still be wrong by 80 miles. You could put a boat on a perfect heading and still miss a convoy that passed through the same latitude 6 hours earlier at 12 knots. The war was turning into a math problem, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. On that desk was an equation some officers would have laughed at if they saw it. A few variables, a few assumptions, and a cold conclusion if merchant shipping had to feed an island empire. Then it had to move through certain places at certain rates. Not because a scout plane spotted it, not because a periscope saw it, because the system demanded it. One number on Knox's paper looked almost insulting in its simplicity. A probability. Not a ship name, not a convoy report. A percentage that suggested. In plain English, if you put a submarine here, long enough, something must pass. And next to it was another number that seemed even more pointless. A grid reference, one boring box on the map that wasn't famous, wasn't dramatic, and wasn't where aggressive captains wanted to be. The core problem was no longer, how do we fight better? It was, how do we stop guessing? Because in 1942, if you guessed wrong, you didn't just miss the enemy. You ran out of time. You ran out of fuel. You ran out of daylight. And sooner or later, you ran out of luck. So Knox's circle started to push an idea that sounded almost offensive to the men risking their lives at sea. Stop chasing sightings. Start hunting the system. Use frequency. Choke points. Schedules, loss patterns. Put submarines where the math said ships had to go even when there was no fresh report, no smoke on the horizon, no certainty at all. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't how hunters talked. But it might be how you collapse an empire's shipping without ever winning a single big surface battle. Stay to the end, because the first time they sent a boat to one of those statistically boring boxes, the ocean stopped being empty, and it started becoming predictable. Now let's rewind back to the first months of 1942 when US submarines were still learning the Pacific the hard way, and why paper math was treated like a joke in a war measured in explosions. In early 1942, the US submarine force didn't have a numbers problem in its own head, it had a hunter problem. The culture was built around one image, a captain at periscope depth. Eyes on a fat silhouette, stopwatch running, calculating angle on the bow, then firing a clean spread at 1,500 yards. That's how the movies worked. That's how the manuals talked. And that's how promotions were imagined: aggressive, decisive, in contact with the enemy. The Pacific didn't care about any of that. The hard rule, spoken and unspoken, was simple. You don't send a submarine to sea to wait for probabilities. You send it to hunt confirmed routes, chase sightings, and make visual contact. If you weren't in the action, you weren't doing your job. And there was a very real reason commanders clung to that rule. Submarines lived on thin margins that could be measured in hours. A fleet boat could sprint on the surface. But underwater, it was a battery animal. Every hour submerged was a calculation: how long until you had to surface and charge? How many minutes could you spend at periscope depth without leaving a wake? How many times could you expose the bridge before an aircraft found you? If you put the boat in the wrong patch of ocean, wrong by even 30 or 40 miles, then you didn't just miss targets. You burned days, you burned diesel, you burned battery cycles, and you forced the crew into extra surfacing periods. The most dangerous moments of the entire patrol. That was the consequence the operational officers could feel in their bones. A bad box wasn't harmless. It was a risk multiplier. One wasted day at 4 knots underwater isn't just 96 nautical miles lost, it's another night you have to surface. Another 15 to 30 minutes with the diesels running. Another chance for a search plane to appear with only seconds to react. And in those seconds, a sub doesn't fight. It dives. It runs. It prays the next splash is off by 50 yards. So when someone at a desk said, "Trust the model," a lot of captains heard. "Trust my guess more than yours while you're the one who gets depth charged." That's where the resistance came from. It wasn't stupidity, it was accountability. The second hard rule was more political than tactical. Patrol success was judged by contact and aggression. A submarine that came back after 21 days with 2 sinkings looked like a weapon. A submarine that came back after 21 days with no contacts looked like failure, no matter how brave the crew had been, no matter how wide the ocean was, no matter how many hours they spent at stations. And there was a third rule nobody wrote down because it sounded too ugly. You don't gamble the lives of 70 or 80 men on a theory that can't be explained in one sentence. Combat officers wanted orders that fit inside a breath: patrol this lane, intercept this convoy, block this strait. They did not want a lecture about frequency, distribution, and variance, especially not when the enemy was already shooting. Knox's problem wasn't creating the logic. His problem was selling it to people who had learned to distrust anything that didn't come from a periscope. He walked into rooms where the air felt like judgment. A few patrol summaries on the table. A tired commander with salt still in his pores. A chart covered in pencil marks. And that same look every analyst eventually recognizes, the look that says, if your idea is wrong, you don't get wet. We do. Even the language itself created friction. Submarine officers spoke in ranges, bearings, and minutes to dive. Analysts spoke in percentages and patterns. One side wanted certainty, the other side only promised odds, and the odds sounded like weakness, because probability is not a word you want to hear when you're sealed inside a steel tube, 200 feet down, listening to propellers overhead and counting the seconds between depth charges. That's why this approach was treated as not allowed. Not because it was forbidden by law, but because it violated the wartime instinct that kept crews sane if I'm going to risk everything. I need a target I can point to, so the resistance hardened into a challenge. Show us one patrol, one box, one result, not a theory, not a map, not a speech, one proof, and the only way to get that proof was to do the very thing everyone feared send a submarine into a place that looked dead on the surface, and trust that the enemy's shipping system was forced to move through it anyway. They didn't get permission in the form of applause. They got it in the form of a shrug. Fine. One boat, one patrol, one boring box. The box itself looked like a mistake, an empty rectangle drawn on a chart. Maybe 60 miles by 60 miles. Sitting off a route that didn't have a famous name. No dramatic strait, no headline island, just water. The kind of assignment a captain could read in 10 seconds and feel his stomach drop. Because every submarine officer knew what boring water usually meant coming home empty. The captain called him a practical man. Not a believer ran the checklist anyway. Torpedo room loaded, a dozen fish ready to go. Batteries topped as much as they could be topped. Fuel measured. Days of rations stacked. The crew counted time in watches 4 hours on, 4 hours off, again and again, until your brain couldn't tell whether it was Monday or Thursday. They left port and slid into the Pacific like a knife into dark cloth. For the first 48 hours in the patrol area, nothing happened exactly what the skeptics expected. The boat spent long stretches at periscope depth, just a thin tube of glass above the surface, scanning in slow arcs. 10 degrees left, 10 degrees right. A full circle takes minutes when you're doing it the safe way. Every ripple could be a wake. Every glare could be a mast. And every false alarm chipped away at confidence. On the third day, the sea gave them a cruel joke smoke on the horizon that turned out to be weather. By day 5, you could feel the question in the air without anyone asking it out loud. How long are we going to sit here? Because sitting was never actually sitting. It was engine management. It was battery management. It was oxygen and CO2 and sweat. It was deciding whether to surface at night to charge risking aircraft at dawn or stay down and go slow. Risking that if you did find a target, you wouldn't have enough battery left to attack properly. Every decision had a number attached to it, even if nobody said the numbers. Then, near the end of a watch, late afternoon light, the kind that turns the sea into metal, the lookout saw something that didn't match the horizon. Not smoke this time. A vertical line. Then another. The captain came up to the scope. He didn't celebrate. He verified. At first it was just geometry 2 masts, a low superstructure, moving left to right. Then it became speed steady. Not wandering maybe 10 knots, maybe 12. Then it became the most important number of all range closing. They didn't have a radio report. They didn't have a sighting from another boat. They had a target in the dead box. On the day the math said the traffic density should spike, because systems don't move randomly when they're feeding an empire. The captain did what submariners were trained to do, because the moment you finally have contact, doctrine becomes your friend again. He turned to intercept. He measured angle on the bow in seconds. He watched the target grow, slow at first, then faster. He waited for the range to fall to something that felt real, 2,000 yards, 1,800, 1,500, close enough that a torpedo didn't have to be a miracle. He fired a small spread. 2 fish, not a dramatic fan of 6. This wasn't a Hollywood attack. This was a test. Then came the quiet terror the runtime. At that range, a torpedo's travel could feel like forever tens of seconds that stretch into a full minute when you're staring through optics and listening to your own breathing. The crew down below didn't see anything. They listened for the screws. They listened for the moment the captain would say the word. Impact. A dull, heavy concussion carried through the water. Not like a gunshot, more like the ocean itself flinching. Through the periscope. The captain saw the merchant ship's line break a flash low on the hull, then a jagged list, then smoke that didn't belong to weather. He didn't linger. He couldn't. A surfaced merchantman could still scream on a radio. A destroyer could appear in minutes if one was nearby. Aircraft could be over them within the time it took to reload one tube. Down. The boat slid under. 50 feet. 100, 150. The captain listened for propellers closing fast. Nothing. No immediate escort, no quick counterattack. Just the ship dying above them. Slow and inevitable. It was a win, but it wasn't the kind that silenced every argument. When the submarine returned and the report hit the table, the combat officers didn't suddenly become believers. They did what professionals do. They looked for alternative explanations. Lucky timing. Sluchina chance. One ship doesn't prove a system. One sinking doesn't justify sending boats to empty water. Maybe the captain would have found that target anywhere if he'd been aggressive enough. But the analysts noticed something different. They saw a dot on a grid that wasn't supposed to pay off. Paying off on schedule. And that meant the model wasn't just interesting. It was usable. Not proven in a way that would satisfy everyone yet, but proven enough to justify the next step. A bigger bet. With less margin for luck. Against an enemy that would not keep sailing predictable routes forever. The first sinking didn't convert the submarine force into believers. It did something more dangerous. It made the idea actionable. Because once you admit that a boring box can pay off, the next question is not philosophical. It's operational. How many boats do you allocate, for how long, and what do you take them away from? In 1942, you didn't have infinite submarines. You had a limited number of hulls, limited crews, limited torpedoes that were still proving unreliable, and a Pacific that could swallow effort without leaving a trace. Every time an analyst drew a new rectangle on a chart, he was effectively spending 20 to 30 days of a boat's life fuel. Batteries, food, and the nerves of 70 to 80 men on a prediction. So Knox's circle didn't ask for trust. They asked for a controlled escalation. Ramp 1 started like a chess move, instead of one submarine wandering a broad lane. They tried a pattern 2 boats, then 3, placed like teeth along a route that merchant traffic had to use if it wanted to make time. Not a single patrol line, more like a net. Each boat took a box measured in dozens of miles, close enough that if a convoy slipped past one, it might still drift into another's field of view within a few hours. The schedule was as cold as it was practical. 4 hours on watch. 4 off. Periscope sweeps timed and repeated. If one boat reported a contact at 0900, another boat 40 or 50 miles away didn't just get excited. It ran math in its head. Convoy speed 10 to 12 knots, heading roughly west, which meant in 3 hours it would be here, in 6 hours it would be there. That wasn't romance. That was geometry. And it started producing something the early war submarine campaign desperately needed: repeatability. Not every day, not every patrol, but enough to change the tone of the war room. A captain would come back and say, "We saw nothing for 5 days. Then we saw 2 ships in one afternoon." Another would say, "The only contact we got was in the box your people drew." A third would admit quietly that the hunt felt less like blinded wandering and more like waiting beside a doorway the enemy couldn't stop using. That's when the enemy reacted. At first, It was subtle convoys began sailing with escorts more often. A merchantman that used to travel alone at 10 knots now traveled with a small grey shadow, maybe one destroyer or sub-chaser, zigzagging in a pattern that stretched the route but made the approach harder. The sea changed, too. A lone ship is a simple problem close to 1,500 yards. Fire 2, dive. A convoy with an escort becomes a countdown. You could feel that countdown in numbers. At periscope depth, you had a thin slice of time minutes. Not hours before the escort's lookouts noticed something wrong. A feather of wake, a flash of glass, a periscope that lingered half a second too long. If you stayed up too long. The response wasn't theoretical, it was immediate. An escort turning hard, closing the bearing at 20 knots and forcing you into a dive with seconds to spare. Then came the first real penalty for being predictable. A submarine in the right box, on the right day, is also a submarine in the right box for the enemy to hunt if the enemy learns the pattern. One boat call it mid-patrol. Batteries not full. Air inside getting stale caught an escort that came straight at the periscope feather like it had been waiting. The captain dove fast, 50 feet, 100, 150. The crew held their breath, the way men do when they know sound travels better than prayers. The first depth charge went off close enough to punch the hull like a fist, not a kill shot, more like a warning. Then another. Then a cluster. Spaced out in a grid. Not random. A depth charge pattern is numbers in violence spacing. Timing. Depth settings. The escort wasn't guessing. It was calculating. The sub went deeper 200 feet. Maybe more slow turn. Silent running. The kind of movement measured in degrees per minute. The captain stopped thinking about sinkings and started thinking about surviving the next 10 minutes. When it finally slipped away after an hour that felt like a day, it did so at a cost you can't see on a chart. Cracked gauges, shaken crew, and the knowledge that the enemy was learning. That was ramp 1, the math started working, and the enemy started adapting. Ramp 2 was harsher, because it forced the US Navy to bet bigger. Japanese shipping didn't stop. It shifted. If a lane started bleeding ships, traffic rerouted to lanes that were longer, closer to air cover, closer to land-based patrol planes, and sometimes through tighter choke points where a submarine had fewer angles of attack. The enemy traded distance for security, which meant Knox's circle had to do something that felt insane to the very captains they were trying to help. They had to predict the reaction, not just the route. On paper, the new logic was simple. If you push pressure here, the flow moves there. If a convoy has to reach point B by day X, and it avoids the dangerous lane, it must pass through the safer lane, which is only safer because you haven't put boats there yet. In practice, it meant sending submarines closer to where submarines could die, boxes moved nearer to island chains, and coastal approaches places with more aircraft, more patrol craft, and less deep water to disappear into. A submarine caught in open ocean can dive and run. A submarine caught in constrained waters can dive, but it can't always escape. The margin shrinks from hours to minutes. Captains hated it for understandable reasons, because now the consequence of being wrong wasn't empty sea. It was shallow water and aircraft overhead. You could measure the risk in a single ugly routine charging batteries. In safe water, you surfaced at night, ran diesels for a while, and prayed in dangerous water. Surfacing wasn't a routine, it was exposure. 15 minutes could be fatal. Even 5 minutes could be fatal if a patrol plane happened to cross your patch of sky at the wrong time. So the boats adapted too. They charged shorter. They stayed down longer. They ran slower. They accepted that every knot underwater cost battery, and every battery hour cost oxygen, and every oxygen hour cost alertness. Men started living by a different clock, not the calendar of days, but the short, brutal rhythm of surfacing windows and dive alarms. And still, the new boxes began to pay off. Not in a way you could brag about on day one, in a way you could only see after several patrols when you laid the contact reports on a table and realized something chilling ships were appearing where the enemy thought he had solved the problem. That's when the pressure crossed a line. Because now the Navy had evidence that prediction wasn't a gimmick, it was a weapon. And once you accept that, you can't go back to pure hunting without feeling like you're choosing blindness on purpose. The point of no return wasn't a speech. It was a decision written in ink, more boats assigned to modeled routes, more patrol time allocated to doorways instead of chasing sightings, and a willingness to risk submarines in tighter, more dangerous water because the payoff wasn't one ship, it was the flow of an entire supply system. From that moment, the campaign stopped being a series of isolated hunts. It started becoming a pressure system, and in the next operation, bigger, faster. With less room for luck, the submarine captains wouldn't just be looking for ships. They'd be waiting at the exact place the ships could not avoid. The decisive fight didn't look like a fleet engagement. No battleships trading broadsides, no carrier decks screaming with launches. It looked like 3 submarines sitting in darkness, spread across an invisible doorway in the Pacific, waiting for a system to do what systems always do, move. The chart on the table was clean and ruthless. 1 choke point, 2 main approaches. A convoy schedule that wasn't confirmed in the way combat men liked, but predictable in the way shipping had to be predictable if it wanted to keep an island empire alive. The analysts didn't promise certainty. They promised pressure, and they placed the boats like a trap, one on the northern edge of the lane. 1 centered, 1 south boxes overlapping by just enough miles that a convoy running 10 to 12 knots couldn't slip through without crossing somebody's periscope arc within a few hours. On the afternoon of the key day, call it mid-1943, a point when both sides had learned and gotten meaner, one of those boats was already low and tired, batteries not at 100%, crew on their 3rd week, air thick enough that men didn't talk much, but the captain stayed up, because the clock mattered more than comfort. At 19:10, the sonar operator picked up screws faint at first, then steady. Not 1 ship, multiple. The bearing held too clean to be fishing boats. The rhythm was wrong for patrol craft. It was the sound of commerce. Contact. Multiple screws. Bearing 095. A convoy. Everything that mattered happened fast. Underwater. Speed was life and death. The captain couldn't just chase at 15 knots and reposition. He had maybe 4 to 6 knots to play with if he wanted to keep battery for the escape. So the intercept wasn't a sprint. It was geometry, angle on the bow, convoy speed. And 1 question. Can I get ahead, or do I have to let it come to me? He did the math in his head. If the convoy was doing 11 knots and he was doing 5 underwater, then he wasn't running it down. He was placing himself where it would pass, like a hunter sitting on a trail, not chasing a deer across a field. At 1935, the periscope came up for a 3-second look. Up. Quick sweep. Down. No lingering wake, no lazy confirmation. The first silhouette was huge merchant hull, fat and slow, stacked high. Behind it, another. And there, closer to the screen of darkness, 1 escort. Maybe 2, weaving like a knife around the herd. Range was still long, likely 4,000 yards or more, too far for comfort. The captain waited for the real numbers range falling. Angle settling. Escort position. He had minutes, maybe less, because the escort pattern was aggressive. A destroyer weaving at 20 knots can eat distance frighteningly fast. If the periscope stayed up too long, it wouldn't be a debate. It would be a bow wave coming straight at the scope feather, and then the sky and sea would explode in depth charge intervals. At 2002, the escort cut across the convoy's front, exactly the kind of movement that kills submarines, because it narrows your safe attack window to a few precise seconds when the escort's stern is turned away. The captain waited for that moment, the way a pilot waits for a firing solution, not with hope, but with discipline. Then the convoy entered the box. The middle ship, a tanker, by the look of the superstructure, crossed the captain's imagined line at about 1,800 yards. The angle was good, the speed steady. The escort had just turned away. The captain didn't ask for perfect. He asked for enough. Stand by. Fire one. A torpedo left the tube with a metallic shove you could feel through the deck. Then another two. Three spaced a few seconds apart. A controlled spread. He wasn't trying to hit everything. He was trying to hit one ship and survive. The run time felt like a slow-motion execution. At that range, even a minute is an eternity. The crew listened to the screws overhead, listened to the boat's own silence, listened for the moment the ocean would announce the result. At 2004, 2 minutes after first fire, the first explosion punched through the water, deep and heavy, like someone slammed a vault door. The captain snapped up the periscope for one more quick look. The tanker was breaking apart low amidships. Flames crawled up its side. The ship began to list. Slow at first, then with a sickening inevitability. But that's when the convoy stopped being prey and became danger. The escort reacted instantly. Not later, not after a debate. It turned hard toward the periscope's last position, closing fast if it started 2,000 yards away at 20 knots. That's about a minute and a half to cross the gap. A minute and a half. That's the whole margin. The captain didn't get to admire the kill. He didn't even get to confirm the sinking. He got one command. Down. Take her deep. The boat slid under 60 feet. 100-150 dive angle steep enough that men grabbed rails. The captain killed everything he could kill, speed reduced. Pumps quieted. Crew told to freeze. A submarine doesn't hide like a man hides behind a wall. It hides by becoming a ghost in a medium that carries sound like a drum. Then the first depth charges arrived. They didn't land at random. They came in a pattern spaced by seconds, walking across the water in a grid. The escort captain was doing his own math now. He knew where the submarine probably dove. He knew how fast it could go. He guessed depth and timed the drops accordingly. Boom close enough to shake instruments, another close enough to kick dust from overhead pipes. The lights flickered once, then held. Men swallowed hard and didn't speak. A single dropped wrench could be death. The submarine eased deeper. 200 feet, maybe beyond. The captain turned 2 degrees, then 2 more, slow and deliberate. Trying to slip out of the pattern without giving away a wake in the water, it was steering by patience. And as that was happening, the larger plan. Knox's plan, the analyst's plan, was executing above them like a machine, because while one escort was chasing one submarine, another U.S. boat was waiting in the next box roughly 40 miles ahead, depending on lane geometry, at 11 knots. A convoy covers about 11 nautical miles per hour. 40 miles is only 3 to 4 hours of travel. If the first boat forced the escorts to scatter, the next boat would meet a convoy that was now disorganized, angry, and making mistakes. The second submarine got its contact at around 22:30. Different crew, same darkness, same sickly air inside a steel tube. They heard the convoy first, then saw it merchant ships now zigzagging, speed uneven, escorts out of position because they had burned time chasing a ghost. This is where the no-turning-back moment arrived, not for the captain at the periscope, but for the doctrine itself. Because now the U.S. submarines were not hunting. They were interdicting. They were positioned so the enemy's reaction became part of the trap. The convoy could change course, could zigzag, could detour, but every detour burned fuel and time. And every safer route pushed it into another predicted doorway. The second captain got a shot that only exists when the enemy is forced to move. He let the convoy come to him, waited until the range collapsed under 2,000 yards, then fired a tighter spread 2 fish at one hull, one at another, timed so that even if the first miss happened, the second would arrive in the same minute. And again the ocean delivered its verdict deep. Heavy impacts, the kind that turn a ship from a machine into a fire. The escort response was furious, but now it was split, one escort searching ahead, one circling behind, none with a clean fix, the convoy's own safety measures zigzagging. Rerouting were making it predictable in a new way, predictable to the trap. Sometime after midnight, the third boat south box picked up distant screws and realized what had happened. The convoy was no longer a clean line of traffic. It was fragments, stragglers, survivors, ships trying to limp away alone. And lone ships in the open ocean are what submarines were built to kill. By dawn, the boats were battered and exhausted. One crew had ridden through depth charge bursts close enough to make men think the hull had cracked. Another had fired enough torpedoes that the racks looked suddenly empty. Everyone had burned battery and air and nerve, but they had also proved something that could not be unproved. They had taken an enemy system shipping lanes, schedules, routing logic, and used it to force contact on their own terms, not once, not by luck, as a repeatable method under pressure. And when the reports hit the planning table, timestamps, bearings, estimated speeds, firing ranges, escort reactions, no one argued about whether paper math belonged in war anymore. The only argument left was how far to push it. Because if 3 submarines, placed correctly, could do this in one night, then the next question was, what happens when you scale it? The boats came back the way submarines always came back, quietly, like nothing happened. No victory parade, no band, just a diesel smell hanging over the pier, men blinking in daylight like they'd been underground, and a stack of patrol reports that looked, on paper, like a set of receipts. Timestamps, bearings, range estimates, torpedoes expended, depth settings, dive times, damage notes written in the dry language of survival. But when those sheets hit the table, the room changed, because this time, the story wasn't "we got lucky." It was the boxes worked. The same ugly details kept repeating across multiple patrols. Contact clusters showing up inside the predicted lanes. Escorts pulled out of position. Lone stragglers peeling away exactly the way the models said they would once pressure forced convoys to zigzag and detour. You could see it in the simplest measurable thing. The ratio of empty days to contact days started flipping. A boat that used to spend 10 days staring at nothing might now get contact in 3. A patrol that used to fire 0 torpedoes now fired a spread 2, 3, 4 because somebody finally put the submarine where targets actually had to pass. And then the bigger number arrived, the one they had teased but refused to say out loud in the beginning. In 1942, the submarine campaign had been painful and inconsistent. Roughly 134 Japanese ships sunk for about 580,000 tons. A lot of effort, a lot of sea time, and still not the kind of pressure that changes an empire's behavior. But as planning tightened and patrol placement stopped being hunt wherever feels right, the curve bent. In 1943, it rose to about 284 ships for roughly 1.34 million tons, more than double the tonnage. Not because torpedoes became magic overnight, but because contact became repeatable. The enemy didn't just lose ships, it lost confidence in routes. That was the real collapse. Not a single spectacular explosion, an entire system forced to reroute. slow down, and bleed. Japanese shipping began behaving like a frightened animal. Convoys grew larger but moved slower. Escorts increased, which meant destroyers and patrol craft were tied to protection instead of offense. Ships detoured around danger zones, which added distance hundreds of extra miles over a voyage, and every extra mile meant more fuel burned, more days exposed, and fewer deliveries per month. The ocean didn't just kill hulls, it taxed time. And time was the one resource Japan couldn't replace. Inside the US Navy. That's when the doctrine shifted from instinct to process. The hard change wasn't we like math now. It was structural. Patrol planning stopped being a captain's personal hunt and became a coordinated campaign. Intelligence officers and analysts were no longer background noise. They became part of the operational chain feeding traffic density maps, schedule estimates, and choke point priorities into the assignments. Submarines weren't thrown into the Pacific like darts. They were placed like pressure valves. You could see the shift in how commanders talked. The old language was romantic, aggressive patrol. Search and attack. Initiative. The new language was mechanical coverage, intercepts, route denial, contact probability. Even the way boats were paired and staged began to change, less lone wolf wandering. More overlapping coverage. More if he dodges here. He appears there. The resistance didn't disappear overnight. Submarine captains still trusted their eyes more than a desk. But after enough patrols returned with the same pattern ships appearing in boring boxes, disappearing along unlikely routes, nobody could claim it was coincidence. The Navy didn't just accept the equation, it reorganized around it. And that was the moment the campaign stopped being a string of patrols. It became a system designed to break a system. After 1943, the war didn't get easier, but it started becoming measurable. The Pacific stopped feeling like a pure gamble where you could steam a couple of 1,000 miles, spend 20 days submerged and exhausted, and come home with nothing but an empty patrol log. Slowly, the ocean became a system you could squeeze routes, speeds, choke points, escort habits, and most importantly, the way the enemy reacted when pressure was applied. That shift didn't belong to one dramatic periscope moment. It belonged to the people who could be ignored, mocked, and overruled until the numbers left everyone with nowhere to hide. Commander Dudley W. Knox wasn't the man sealed inside a steel tube at 200 feet, listening to screws overhead and counting the seconds between depth charges. His battlefield was a planning table, charts flattened under desk lamps, patrol reports stacked like bricks, and arguments that could end careers with one sentence impractical to many combat officers. He was a desk-bound theorist talking about probability, while real men had to surface to charge batteries and could die in under a minute if a patrol plane appeared at the wrong angle. But that distance from instinct was exactly what let him see what instinct often misses. The Pacific was too big for try harder to be a plan. And an island empire couldn't feed itself with random movement. A shipping system has to flow. And if it has to flow, it has to pass through certain doors. Once the reports started piling up, those doors stopped being abstract. The same boring boxes produced contact again and again. The lanes labeled unlikely started swallowing ships. And the curve, the one that mattered, began to bend. The enemy didn't just lose hulls. He lost confidence in routes. Convoys grew larger but slower. Escorts multiplied, tying up warships in protection instead of offense. Ships detoured around danger zones, adding distance hundreds of miles over a long voyage, burning fuel and time, and increasing exposure every extra day they spent at sea. On a strategic level, that's what collapse looks like. Not one spectacular explosion, but a system forced to move out of rhythm until it starts bleeding from the inside the US Navy. The real change wasn't we like math now, it was organizational. Patrol planning became less about lone hunters chasing sightings and more about coverage, intercepts, and denial submarines placed like teeth across a doorway, waiting for the flow that had no other option. When Japan shifted routes, the response wasn't panic, it was prediction measure the reaction. Anticipate the next move, then move the pressure to the new door. At that point, the submarine campaign stopped being a string of isolated patrols. It became a pressure system designed to break a pressure system. Here's the honest frame. The hard facts are that U.S. submarine results rose sharply from 1942 into 1943, and that patrol placement and routing became increasingly systematic as intelligence and planning tightened. The exact emotions in the room, the eye rolls, the sarcasm, the private resentment, those are inference. But the tension between operational instinct and analytical planning is real, because every wartime organization has to fight that battle inside itself before it can win it against the enemy. What stands out to me isn't genius, it's restraint. The ability to ignore ego and trust patterns when everyone else demands something you can point at with a finger. That kind of discipline is rare in war, and it's rare in life. And that's why this story still matters. In business, technology, or your own personal decisions. Brute force feels heroic work harder, push more, move faster, but brute force rarely scales. Systems do. If you're stuck, don't only ask who isn't trying hard enough. Ask where the flow actually moves, what doorway it must pass through, and what happens to the system if you apply pressure there. Measure that door. Put your limited resources where they can't be dodged. And when the system reacts, don't flinch, predict the reaction and shift your pressure accordingly. If you want more WWII stories where the win doesn't come from luck, but from decisions you can measure. Hit like and consider subscribing. And thank you for watching on this channel. You're not just an audience. You're one of the people keeping these memories alive. Now tell me in the comments if you were the commander. Would you trust the instincts of the men in the field, or the cold equation on Commander Dudley W. Knox's desk?